Hi, I'm Nancy, and this is my Detroit. We're starting our walk up Woodward here at the base of Woodward and Hart Plaza. And we're pretty much where we left off on our last tour when we looked at the riverfront of Detroit. But before we start our walk, I wanted to talk to you about something very important that happened here on July 23rd, 1963. On that day, Martin Luther King Jr. led his March to Freedom right down Woodward Avenue with about 125,000 people. When they got to this intersection, they made a hard right and they went down Jefferson Avenue to the TCF Center that's right down the road. And the march was made because of segregation. Segregation of jobs, segregation of housing, and segregation of schools. And the interesting part is that he made this speech at TCF Center, which at that time was called Cobo Arena. And it was named after Albert Cobo, who was a past mayor of Detroit, and he was known for his segregation. In that speech, if you ever take a look at it, and you should online, it was a precursor to his I Have a Dream speech, which he gave in Washington, D.C. in front of the Lincoln Memorial just 2 months later. You'll hear such things as, I have a dream, the mountain of despair, and free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. This is the Michigan Labor Legacy Monument, and it's at the foot of Woodward Avenue at Jefferson. And as it says on this plaque, it's honoring the women and men of the city of Detroit. And it's labor's gift to the city of Detroit, and it was given to us on the 300th anniversary of Detroit's founding in 2001. If you take a look at the actual monument, it looks like it's a complete circle, but it's not. There's a gap at the top, and that gap represents labor's struggle over the years. And how it ties in with Martin Luther King Jr.'s march back in 1963 is that there is a quote from his speech on that monument, and it says, "The arch of history bends toward justice." It also ties in because there are 24 bronze reliefs that surround this arch, and one of those bronze reliefs gives information of the march on that day. We're standing in the middle of Jefferson Avenue with Woodward Avenue going that way. And this sculpture is called the Tribute to Joe Louis, but we in Detroit just call it the Fist. And 24 is the number associated with this piece because the fist is 24 feet long and the structure that holds it up is 24 feet tall. And there was a lot of controversy when it was first put up because people felt that this particular statue did not do justice to Joe Louis. But if you go down the street over to TCF Center, you can find a full-length statue of Joe there. I want to tell you a couple of stories about Joe Louis because it's pretty fascinating. Joe Louis was born Joe Louis Barrow in Alabama in 1914. And his father died when he was 2 years old, and his mom remarried, and they moved up here to Detroit. And his mom, like any of us moms, wanted to keep him out of trouble. So she gave him money for violin lessons. And Joe took that money for violin lessons, walked down the street, walked in the opposite direction, went down to the local boxing ring and took boxing lessons. And in order so his mom wouldn't find out, he dropped the Barrow from his name and just became Joe Louis. Now you and I can try and figure out if his mom ever found out. I think she did. The rest is history. He became world heavyweight champion in 1937, and he kept that title until he retired in 1949. And one of the best stories about Joe Louis were his 2 fights with a German named Max Schmeling. And this happened in 1936 and 1938. And it was during the time when the Nazis were coming to power, fascism was in Germany, and those 2 fights became a symbol of democracy versus fascism. And just to let you know, Joe lost the first one, but he won the second one. And he and Max Schmeling became lifelong friends. Unfortunately, later in Joe's life, he didn't manage his money as well as he might have. And when he passed away in 1981 from a heart attack, he was broke. And so his friends got together and started raising money for his funeral. And he had served in World War II. So Ronald Reagan, who was president then, went to Arlington Cemetery and asked if he could be buried there. And he was. During the funeral, Max Schmeling not only helped pay for the funeral, but was also a pallbearer. I'm standing in front of one of the main symbols of Detroit, This statue is called the Spirit of Detroit, and if you've ever seen anything about Detroit, you're probably going to see a picture of this statue. It's on t-shirts, it's on billboards, it's on pictures, it's everywhere. And this statue was placed here in 1958 by a sculptor called Marshall Fredericks, and he is a Michigan native. And if we take a look at the statue, there are some major pieces to it. There obviously is the big green guy, who's the Spirit of Detroit. But in his hands, he holds an orb, he holds some people, and then there's a scripture reading in back of him. The inscription behind him is from 2 Corinthians 3:17. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Every once in a while, we dress up this guy. He gets to wear clothes. Usually it's when a sport team wins a championship. So for example, when the Red Wings win the Stanley Cup, which hasn't been for a while, he'll wear a size 360 jersey. Most recently, he got a set of scrubs, which were meant to honor the healthcare workers in our area. We're standing in front of the One Woodward building, which is right across the street from the Spirit of Detroit. The reason I find this building fascinating is because of its architect. His name was Minoru Yamasaki. And Minoru Yamasaki also designed other buildings in the United States, one of which, actually two of which, you may know about. So let's take a look at the building. It's got tall windows, and it's got little arches on the top and on the bottom, kind of like what we've got here. I'll give you a minute to think about what other building this could remind you of. If you guessed the Twin Towers in New York, you would be correct. Minoru Yamasaki was the architect for the World Trade Center Twin Towers. But he built this building in 1963, so the Twin Towers were built after that date. So this building actually was a precursor to the Twin Towers in New York. We're here at the foot of Woodward Avenue, and we're going to start our walk up Woodward. But before we do that, I wanted to give you a brief history of the street. It's named after a man named Augustus Woodward, who was the first Chief Justice of the Michigan Territory back in the early 1800s. And back then, it's hard to understand, but because we got tall buildings here and concrete and everything else. But back then, all this was a wooden fort and a bunch of wooden buildings, and they burned to the ground in 1805. So Augustus Woodward and his colleagues decided that they needed to design a new street structure, a new layout for Detroit. And we'll talk about that a little later when we're at Grand Circus Park, but for right now, just let it be known that this is Woodward Avenue. And the street is 28 miles long. It ends in a city called Pontiac. A couple of fun facts about Woodward Avenue. The first paved stretch of highway was here on Woodward Avenue, and it was in 1909, and it was a 1 mile stretch between 6 and 7 Mile Road. And of course, the other fun fact that if you're not from around here, you're probably going, Woodward Avenue, Woodward Avenue. Yes, this is the Woodward Avenue of the Dream Cruise every year, only it's quite a few miles up the street. So as we continue our walk up Woodward, there are going to be 3 names that I am going to repeat over and over and over. The first one is Albert Kahn, the second one is Wirt Rowland, and the third one is Dan Gilbert. Now the first 2 guys are architects that built the beautiful buildings in downtown Detroit back in the early 1900s. The third person, Dan Gilbert, is the guy that brought them back to life. And Dan Gilbert is the owner of Quicken Loans, Bedrock Real Estate, and Rocket Mortgage. So let's get started. The building behind me is the Vinton Building, and it was built in 1917 in a neoclassical style. And what's a neoclassical style, you might ask? Well, it's because people back in the early 1900s really liked the Roman and the Greek look on their buildings. And this, if you take a look at the top of the Vinton Building, you're going to see a cornice up there that goes like this and turns, and that's neoclassical. Just kitty corner across Woodward from the Vinton Building is the Cathedral of Finance, the Guardian Building, my absolute favorite building in the city of Detroit. It was architected by Wirt Rowland, and it is the perfect combination of Art Deco, arts and crafts, and Native American design. And the difference on this one that I see is that it's not gray, it's not white, it's this beautiful orangish red brick. And that was done on purpose because Wirt Rowland believed that color was very important in designing a building. A quote from him is, "I use the color on purpose. We no longer live in a leisurely age. What we see, we must see quickly in passing, and the impression must be immediate, strong, and complete. Color has this vital power." And that was said back in the early 1920s, and it's still true today. Now, we're not going to go inside the building right now because this is going to be a separate segment that I am going to do on the big three of Wirt Rowland, which is the Guardian, the Penobscot, and the Buell building, which are all in this particular block. So stay tuned and you'll learn more. Right across the street from the Guardian building is the Cube. That's spelled Q-U-B-E, and I'll explain why it's named that in a minute. But it's modern architecture, and it was built in 1959. The interesting part about this building is not necessarily the building, which is marble and glass, but what was here before this building was here. The Hammond building, which was the first skyscraper in Detroit, was built in the late 1800s, and it was a whole 10 stories tall. And everybody was just agog because they'd never seen a building in the city that tall before. But it was razed to the ground in 1956 to build the Cube. And today, it is owned by Dan Gilbert, and it is the headquarters for Quicken Loans. Directly across the street from the Cube, which, by the way, the reason it's Q-U-B-E is because it is Quicken Loan headquarters, is the First National building. This building was built in 1922, and its architect was Albert Kahn. And it's neoclassical architecture, and you can tell that because of the 18 Corinthian columns that wind its way all around the building. The building is huge. It actually takes up almost a city block, and it's kind of in a Z shape. It was built in two different parts. And this building was actually the first building that Quicken Loan bought when they were moving into Detroit and buying up buildings and rehabbing them. And this was Quicken Loan's first headquarters downtown. Welcome to Campus Martius. As you walk up Woodward Avenue from the south, the first thing that you're going to see here is the Michigan Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It was a tribute to Michigan Civil War soldiers who perished in the war, and it was dedicated in 1867. It's one of Detroit's oldest pieces of public art. This statue is really tall. It's 60 feet high, and it consists of 4 layers. The first layer, as you can see, are the eagles that go around it. The second commemorates the different branches of the Army that fought in the Civil War. The third level represents the spirit of the war, things like emancipation and courage. And then the top is a really tall woman with a shield and a spear, and she represents victory. And if you look around, there's also 4 bas-reliefs, and they are pictures of the 4 Union guys who made the war winnable. And that was Lincoln, Sherman, Grant, and Farragut. Here we are in the middle of Campus Martius. And in case you wonder what Campus Martius means, it means Field of Mars or Field of War. This is where the militia drilled back in the 1800s. It's where people gathered to find out who was winning or losing the battles in the Civil War. And it was where people gathered to learn about Lincoln's assassination. This particular spot is very special because it is Detroit's point of origin. And there's a plaque here on the ground that shows it. And if you remember when I talked about Augustus Woodward in planning the city of Detroit, he wanted to make these hexagonal pieces, little parks all the way through Detroit, in which boulevards would come out from, streets would come out from, and he modeled it after L'Enfant's plan of Washington, D.C., with a slight tweak. So from this point, on the ground, it shows where Woodward comes in, where Monroe comes in, where Grand River comes in. There are many streets that branch out from this exact spot. And unfortunately, that plan did not come to fruition for a number of different reasons. One was because the fort was in the way, that's a problem, and also because people just didn't like the plan. But in another segment, I'll take you up to Grand Circus Park, which is another example of this type of street design. So if you come down to Campus Martius, there's a lot of things that you can do here. A lot of them involve sitting and just kind of watching people and watching how the city goes by you. But there's different pieces to Campus Martius. There is the beach, which is behind me, the other side of the fountain. There you can pull up a chair on the sand, order a drink, and just enjoy the time. You can sit around the fountain, beautiful fountain. It actually does that, the different ways that the water spurts up like that, and just watch it do that. Or you can come here where the grass is, and this is where they have movies sometimes during the summer. During the winter, this is where the skating rink is. And the Christmas tree will be right over there. Just to the east of Campus Martius is Cadillac Square. This long rectangular square used to house a beautiful large market, the Central Market, in the 1800s. And this is where the farmers would bring their vegetables and their meats and sell them on various days of the week. Today, it has food trucks. But one thing that was of note in this square during those markets was this beautiful cast iron, wrought iron building, which is where all of the food vendors sold their wares. And in the late 1800s, they closed down the market in this square, and they pretty much went over to Eastern Market, where we saw before. But that particular structure was taken over to Belle Isle and made into a horse stable. And it kind of started to fall apart. And in 2013, the Henry Ford bought it, and they are in the process of renovating it to put in the Greenfield Village. Believe it or not, this is a drinking fountain. The Bagley Memorial Fountain was built in the late 1800s upon a request from the mayor of Detroit, John Bagley. And he wanted to make sure that the residents of Detroit always had clean water to drink. So if the water was running today, you would see water coming out of each of the lions' mouths, and you would be able to put your cup under this and get a drink. The entire fountain, complete with its peaked roof, was designed on a building, after a building that was in St. Mark's Square in Venice. And this fountain has been moved around Detroit a few times. It was in Campus Martius for a while, and then they finally brought it down here to the foot of Cadillac Square, where it's been its home ever since. We're at the old Wayne County Courthouse, which is at the end of Cadillac Square on Randolph Street. This building was built in the very late 1800s and housed the courts for the city. And it's a Beaux Arts architecture, which means, to me, means fancy. My favorite part about this building is the quadrille at the top, and those are basically the two green statues that you see at the top of the building, and they are a pair of chariots, horses, and women driving the chariots, and they represent progress. A lot of steps on this one, but this building was inspired by the Chicago World Exposition in the late 1800s. Think the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, which is the style. Fun fact about this building: it was designed by an architectural firm run by the Scott brothers. And they had an apprentice that came in to work with them for no pay, mind you. And they fired him after the first year because they said he had no aptitude for the work. So who was that? Albert Kahn. Boy, were they wrong. This building is now empty. Basically the court folks moved over to the Guardian building. So this building, gorgeous building right now, is empty. So we've been doing a lot of walking, and it's lunchtime. So I decided to come to the place in Detroit that exemplifies Detroit cuisine, the Coney Island. For those of you who are not from this area, a Coney Island is a hot dog on a bun covered with chili with no beans, mustard and onions, and don't put ketchup on it. So the story behind this is 103 years ago, Just Kiros came to Detroit from Greece and opened up American Coney Island, sold the Coneys for 5 cents a piece. And business was really brisk, so he brought over his brother William to help him. And William ended up opening up Lafayette Coney Island. So now we have two brothers in competition with each other. I wonder if they ever fought with each other. Anyway, turned out it was a pretty friendly competition, but 30 years ago, approximately, the employees bought Lafayette Coney Island. So now you've got different people running the different places, but they're still right next door. For Detroit, he had a point of origin. Okay, you're gonna watch me walking down steps because my video crew told me to, so I'm gonna hang on here. Business was brisk, so he brought over his brother William from Greece to help him. Perfect, thank you. His door and opened up his own place called Lafayette Coney Island. So, two brothers competing with each other. I wonder if they argued about anything. The last story is, okay, gotcha.